I'm just going to say a little bit before I start flicking through the slides. We might put the first slide on, actually, because it's boring just to look at the title. Because I want to contextualise something, the women's work in relation to what was going on. So, the male avant-garde in the 1970s, as those of you that have read some art history will probably know, was dubbed as male and pale. We received various news items about protest events in the US through publications like Heresies and Art Forum, and groups like Art and Language, Artists Meeting for Cultural Change, these are American groups, the Art Workers Coalition, also American, and the Art Workers Union, which later manifested throughout most of the states in Australia. Now, Lucy Lippard was an important, at the time, in the 70s, in Australia, and I know that Brown Council has picked up on this by revisiting her visit, as it were, and restaging some of that. But Lippard's influential book, 6 Years, The Dematerialisation of the Art Object, which was published in 1973, was a really key text for the avant-garde, especially here in Sydney, and I show you some of the protagonists here, because of the male triumphant, it was at the time, from Inhibitoris. And they were Mike Parr, Tim Johnson, Peter Kennedy, who were all in that book. And they subsequently stayed in touch with Lucy Lippard as a contact for them in New York. But there were no female artists included in Lippard's book from Australia. On one level, this tells us a lot about the importance of lobbying. However, Barbara Hall, who was active at Inhibitoris, she was then the partner of Peter Kennedy and a collaborator in some of his works, who often gets forgotten, she notes that there were really very few women active in the experimental art scene in Australia in the early years of the 1970s. And it wasn't until International Women's Year in 1975 that Lippard turned her attention to female artists in Australia. She was commissioned that year to give the Power Lecture and subsequently toured the country and spread the news and the political strategy of what she was calling the East-West Bag Project, which was a grand scheme for women's art registers across the world, and she was promoting them to be across Australia. And the idea was that these registers would document and network together so as to save the important work of women artists. And this was women artists across the board, historically and contemporary, so not just performance art. So women's art movements had already formed in Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide by the mid-70s. The big women's shows were celebrating work by women. But many of these women are now forgotten. In Australia, the Women's Show, which was 1977, and the Lovely Motherhood Show from 1979 were both blockbuster shows that included a broad spectrum of work from a very wide demographic of women. Shining the spotlight on women's art meant that the hitherto unknown artists came out. So just by asking women to come forward, a lot of artists came forward that people didn't know about. And many of these artists hadn't exhibited professionally at the time. I've always said that it'd be really interesting to do research on these shows and ascertain how many of these artists continued to exhibit after the 1970s and into the 1980s. It also tells us something about the art world and how it itself creates histories. You need to do that lobbying that Parr and Kennedy and others were very good at, and you need to sustain the practice in a public sense. But what's most significant about the Women's Show, for example, and what I've just said about this making of history, was that it was exhibited by the exhibition was curated, rather, by a collective of over 50 women who formed into subgroups around genres, mediums and issues. So this was 50 people getting together on a weekly basis with supposedly no hierarchy, to actually curate these exhibitions. Now, most curators would go, ho, 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 this is really difficult. And it was very difficult, I believe. Now, this collective organising structure gave voice, of course, to a very wide range of women, but it wasn't without organisational problems. Huge teams of volunteers were required to facilitate the shows, and some fairly big arguments, as well as a lot of discussions, were had within this collective concerning power. The major unresolved issue, which was mentioned by Julie Ewington in the post-event publication, were sexuality, the work of artists, and politics, like artist labour. And I picked up on this later in a little publication I did for the women's art movement in 1980 titled Difference, A Radical Approach to Women and Art. The issues were about artist labour and work rights and the politics of sexuality within that collective. Now, just to bring it up to the present, we see quite recently Rosie Bradotti, who's living in Europe now but is an Australian, picking up on these arguments and arguing that in 21st century feminism, a radicalisation of feminist philosophy is taking place. And she says that this is taking place through a reconsideration of the priority of sexuality and the relevance of the sex-gender distinction. In short, Bradotti says that Western feminism dismissed sexual difference. And I quote from her, in the name of a polemical form of anti-essentialism or a utopian longing for the position beyond gender. Now, I can't go into this in great detail today, but I would argue that this shot through 70s feminism, and the arguments did, and really was part of its kind of collapse to a certain extent. Now, this quote that I've just taken from Bradotti is from her 2011 book called Nomadic Subjects, and it's associated with new materialisms, which is one arm of which reassesses this would-be essentialism and gender difference. Now, I don't really want to analyse all the problems within the 70s women's movement today, only to point out that the issue of sexuality, which was silenced by neoliberalism as feminism became a white and middle-class movement, has not gone away. It's arisen again and is very much on the new feminist agenda. One thing about feminism that makes it different from other political and philosophical programs is that it is an embodied position. Power's played out on the female body, and we see this happening very, very clearly today with all those arguments about the burqa, for example. They're women and are women, and who's free and who's not. Now, my intention today is to look at the work by female performance artists from the 1970s and early 80s and to consider how they addressed this challenge of the male and pale avant-garde that they encountered. So women's place in the avant-garde was conflicted. The idea of the male avant-garde auteur, who we see some protagonists on the screen, was being criticised by feminist art historians, and as the 70s came to a close, cultural feminism, which celebrated women's difference, was being challenged by academic feminism, which considered the celebration of women's difference to be essentialist, i.e. it focused on biological difference rather than the social construction of gender. Now, Marxist structuralist feminism was prevalent in Screen magazine, where Laura Mulvey famously published her book, her article on the male gaze in 1975. And this magazine, Screen, was really eagerly read by Australian academics. And we see in Australia at this time a shift in emphasis as women turned towards British feminism for theoretical nourishment. People like Juliet Mitchell, Jacqueline Rose, Mary Kelly, who did postpartum document. And these quickly replaced the North Americans who had been prevalent. Lucy Lippard, Linda Nochlin and Judy Chicago, who'd influenced the decade previously. So this period I'm going to talk about is a period which is really alive and very noisy, and there's this clash within feminism, and there are always clashes within feminism, but this clash was historically very, very significant. So this shift takes us from an experiential cultural feminism into a full-blown academic structuralist psychoanalytic feminism. And the demographic shifts. Activism is replaced by academicism. Women's experience is no longer considered a uniting force, and gender is deconstructed as a representation, of course, following Louis Althusser. We're always already written by a language over which we have very little control. So in this scheme of things, woman is a social construct, and according to psychoanalysis, of course, woman does not exist. It's taken 30 years of work to actually figure out what's wrong with this and who lost out and why. The jumble and the tyranny of theory is still being worked out, but the current debates around new materialism are encouraging, if somewhat utopian in part. Now I'm going to turn to the slides. You're going to, that's enough for that bit, and consider some of the ways in which women in Australia contested the avant-garde. And I want to explore some of the themes then that developed and where they sit in relation to art history and art theory. So Mike Parr and Peter Kennedy performing on the screen, if we just go back, sorry, I know you've looked at it for a while, from idea demonstrations. And what they're doing is creating a frame around a wall to outline the frame of the camera's lens. Now this was a very important work, and it's a great example of artists interrogating the medium. You know, when we talk about the avant-garde in Avant-Garde 1010 in art history, we say, you know, what makes it different from other things? It interrogates its medium. It's one of the things we say. It's also a work that analyses the documentation of the action, and endlessly these performances are being filmed, videotaped and so forth. The instructions are being given over the film. Kennedy's told to move this way, move that way. Parr's instructing him all the time. So all of idea demonstrations, I'd argue, was based on these simple instructions to be carried out. Some of them were cool and quasi-structuralist, like this one on the screen, while others were pretty hot and violent and more existential, like Parr's instruction, let a friend bite into your shoulder until blood appears, which, you know, frightened Terry Smith, who was the critic in Sydney at the time. Now, alongside this serious avant-garde sat the happening crowd, and we can have the next slide now. We'll start doing the slides now. They're depicted here by Sylvia and the Synthetics, who were performing at the All Senses Ball in Canberra. In Sydney, there were similar activities that older members of the audience will know about that were regularly based at the Yellow House here. And in the next slide, who I'm showing you here is a very forgotten artist called Melanie Howard, and I'm sitting here alongside Tim Johnson from Inhibidus, his work not performed in Inhibidus, called Dusting and Tickling, and he's tickling his wife Vivian Johnson, who would later become one of Australia's leading art historians of Aboriginal art. Now, Howard's project, you can see her, she is she's performing as the artist's muse, if you like. What she did, she calls it a pedagogical performance work, and she was associated with the Experimental Art Foundation in Adelaide, which is the equivalent of what Inhibidus was here at that time. And she gives the male and pale avant-garde fellows, some of whom she's intimate with, a camera and a lot of film, and she says, I want you to photograph me. I want you to take portraits of me. And the portraits they took of her were all of her in the nude, and invariably involved various props. She gave them a whole bag full of kind of toys that they could use. Most of them used these domestic props, so you see her female body with little dining room chairs on its pubis and so on and so forth. It's quite a hilarious project when you see all 100 slides, but I haven't got time to show you all of them. But juxtaposing here as an intervention into some of this avant-garde work. Now, more exacting, and I'll have the next slide, more exacting, I think, than the last comparison is this one where Noel Sheridan, who was the very charismatic Irish director of the Experimental Art Foundation at the time, presented a very long monologue about censorship in the arts by using a fridge that had been submitted for a group show and excluded by the EAF executive because it was blatantly sexist. The fridge was taken from a group house inhabited by the male pale avant-gardists, and Sheridan's performance presented the graffiti on the fridge, which he projected as slides, and this graffiti detailed the sexual conquests of women artists in pretty graphic detail by the men that were living in the house, with fairly explicit and defamatory remarks about the females' various individual bodies. But what was most prominent in the image of Sheridan, as you see it here, was he's standing in front of the fridge with an Australian flag of independence used by Maoists at the time. Now, the reference here, I believe, was clearly to the progressive art movement in Adelaide, and where members who were also on the executive of the EAF who'd excluded the fridge. So there's two things going on here, and the progressive art movement wasn't exclusively feminist at all. In fact, they were card-carrying Maoists. So there's two things going on. There's a kind of a poignant kind of critique of the left, but also a poignant critique of feminism and a kind of rallying cry not to have any censorship in the arts, but all caged in a fairly sexist kind of language. So I'm juxtaposing Sheridan's monologue with the fridge, with Melanie Howard's pubis, which is being made domestic by one of her female photographers. Now, this kind of sexism in the art world came to attention in Art Forum in 1974, and we can have the dildo pair now, when Linda Benglis took off the great, I think it was Robert Morris, to task by taking out an advert in Art Forum, where we see her sporting this erect dildo. Now, the backstory to this controversial performance is pretty well known in the art world, but I'll just fill it in for those that don't know. The editorial committee of Art Forum were really split about Benglis putting in this photograph of herself with a dildo. And it created a great ruckus, and Rosalind Krauss, who became the darling of post-structuralist art history in the 80s and 90s, was really annoyed that Benglis manages to get this image in Art Forum by taking out an advert, because that was in a different department. So she gets in the magazine by going through the advertising section of the institution. So Rosalind Krauss, who gets really, really upset, storms out of Art Forum and sets up the journal October, which became the theoretical Bible of the postmodern period. And in so doing, and she said there would be no advertising in Art Forum because it was a serious scholarly journal, but what they did in effect was to foreclose on any further activism by artists like Benglis. Now, the irony is, of course, is that October, which became this main journal of the postmodern period, was the magazine that was going to bring in post-structuralism to America, and some would say to the Western art world. But we might now question the monopoly of this journal, or that it had at the time. So decades later, there was a collaboration, which you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, between Australian and Canadian artists who used the Benglis work to restage or re-perform the theoretical importance of this image, and they did so in a very small artist-run initiative in the suburbs of Melbourne. So not the international stage, but evidence that activism is still alive and well in the 21st century. This was just a couple of years ago, 2010, 6 years ago. So I want to turn my attention now, we'll get the next slide, to a lesser-known artist, Barbara Cleveland, who's been brought to attention, as Di has said in her introduction, through the archival researches of the artists associated with Brown Council. Now, Cleveland lived and worked in Sydney in the early 70s and was well known to the artists at Inhibitris. In fact, Mike Parr, and you can still look this up on the internet, remembered her very well as a radical dildo-wielding artist in a keynote lecture he delivered at Goma in Brisbane a few years ago. It's still on their website. It's wonderful. But evidence has recently come to light which shows Cleveland active in France in the 1960s, most likely being one of the female participants in Yves Klein's performance paintings at that time. We can have the next slide. And now Cleveland was obviously a maverick performance artist in the 1970s and one of the first artists to adopt what we now call re-performance or delegated performance. And here we see her, I believe, re-performing one of Vito Acconci's adaptation studies from 1971. And like Melanie Howard, Cleveland was critical of the male avant-garde and concerned to topple the originality myth by duplicating these one-off performance works in this kind of re-performance mode, which has become well, I wouldn't say popular, but it's come to our attention in the last 5 or 10 years. So she's really ahead of her time. The next slide. Jill Scott. So I'm trying to trace people that have come and gone from Australia a little bit here. Jill Scott left Australia in the mid-1970s to live in the US, and later she moved to Europe, to Zurich. But she presented site-specific works where the female body is bound and contained. The performance Taped, which you see on the right-hand side, has been restaged in Australia recently at the Museum of, what is it called? No, not the museum. The Monash University Museum of Art, I should remember that. And at the EAF, now the Adelaide EAF, was it the Australian EAF? I can never remember. And this has been done in the last couple of years by a younger artist called Mira Oscar Wiegel. Now, until the re-performance that Mira did, the work was always seen to be a mute work, like there was no soundtrack, because there was no script available, or the historians, myself included, who actually know Jill Scott, hadn't actually asked her if there was a script, and she wasn't forthcoming, so I didn't probe it. But there was a script, and Taped had a soundtrack. And that soundtrack, it comes about as the female body is completely taped to the wall, and we don't know that there's a tiny microphone in there, and the female body, the female speaks about woman's confinement in the home, words and phrases that are uttered from beneath the tape, beneath this confinement, and they're amplified, giving this work a clear feminist meaning that was not apparent without the voice. So without the voice, we'd see this as another endurance work. We put it into avant-garde endurance work category, and we wouldn't see this feminist kind of take that's coming. Now, I want to continue to pick up on a few themes that preoccupied women artists in the 1970s. And these themes, I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, not just that quickly, are motherhood and kind of domestic chores. Then I'm going to do the environment, and then I'm going to do rape. So this is Jude Adams' washing performance from 1979 and the childcare performance from 1980. Jude Adams was associated with the EAF in 1979, installed herself in their public bathroom facilities to wash her child's nappies 24 hours a day over about a week. It was a pretty putrid bathroom, I tell you. Similar things happening in the streets, although the nappies were not soiled, probably because of occupational health and safety or biohazard, in 1980, where she's performing a kind of street theatre with other women. If we get the next slide. This is one of my favourite slides from the archive. This is an artist, Anne Fogarty. One performance, it doesn't matter that she didn't do any others. This is a great performance. So it's part of the Women at Work exhibition, which is the first female, all-female performance festival held at the Ewing George Payton in 1980. And she's out there with her grandmother's mangle. You can still see them in antique shops. And she's simulating washing sheets, but each sheet spells out the name of mother, which she hangs in the courtyard at the university. Okay, next slide. I've just put this in because I couldn't resist, and Benita Eli is a Sydney-based artist, of course. Some note, this is her 1982 work, A Mother Shows Her Daughter to the Universe, a celebratory work which the academic feminists would definitely say was essentialist. We'll show you the next slide. What Eli really becomes famous for, I think, and what her great significance or contribution to the history of performance art is the work she's done around the environment. And this is the groundbreaking work she did in 1979 called Jabiluka UO2, which is a protest work against uranium mining, which was situated close to the Kakadu World Heritage National Park. And it's an important work of its time, an endurance piece which involved creating a kind of delicate kind of spiral or mandala out of found materials or natural materials, which was then sliced through by a surveyor's chalking machine and destroyed. So a quiet but effective political action. It was, I believe, one of the sculpture triennales, and it may have been the one that was at La Trobe University, but don't quote me on that. Eli continued with the next slide, 1980, with this work, which has been shown a lot. Murray River Punch, probably shown a lot because it was videotaped. By then, the video documentation had become easier for artists. And Murray River Punch restages one of those shopping mall or supermarket kind of booths you find where people are offered, the cheese on the cracker or the latest diet food. And she's doing it twice here, once at the University of Melbourne for Women at Work and in the Adelaide Mall in 1980, which was part of a festival that the EAF had created in 1980. So she's offering people this concoction, which is the pollutants that are found in the Murray River, and it's quite a stinky work by the time she's put all the rabbit dung in the blender and everything. Next slide. Okay. Jill Orr has been making work consistently. Now, consistently, unlike Anne Fogarty, who goes off the radar historically, Jill Orr and Benita Eli, of course, stay centre stage because of their tenacity and because they keep producing good work, no doubt. And she's been making, like Benita Eli, she's been making works about the devastation of the environment since 1978. And here we see some very early works from the archive, a work called Response, which was at La Trobe University. And if we have the next slide, Map of Transition, also from the same year, which is at the Ewing George Payton Gallery. Now, both Eli and Orr, if we look at their oeuvre as art historians, use natural and found materials and work within the philosophy of what we would call arte povera, by stepping very lightly on the landscape so that practice and process meet political issues in these works. And I would argue bring them up to the current kind of new feminist kind of lingo that we're getting used to now with new materialisms, that they were doing feminism rather than being feminist, way before this notion of doing became acknowledged through the new materialists. I'm going to be right on time. The next slide. Jill Orr, this is a very well-known work. I've tried to include black and white documentation because we're talking about the 70s, and most of what was being shown then would have been black and white documentation or 35mm colour slides. But I've tried to keep as black and white as I can. Bleeding Trees from 1979. I think the importance of this work has to do with the documentation, because this work was never performed live, but this is the documentation of the live performance that's in the gallery. So it's a real dichotomy, this work, and one that's very interesting for students to talk about in their essays, because it's performed for the camera exclusively, and then the images are used as projections, and then a performance is performed in front of them. But Jill, who I know quite well now, will never tell me what she did in front of these images. Okay, this is the performance. So it's an interesting work about that, again, that notion of originality. The next slide. This is work Jill Orr did at the Experimental Art Foundation. Quite a profound work. It's called She Had Long Golden Hair, and it's about rape and abuse towards women and the ritual of cutting women's hair. So she walks into the space, there's a soundtrack, and the chorus of the soundtrack is, "Which bitch mole dyke, which bitch mole dyke, which bitch mole dyke." And she comes in, she's dressed like this, beautifully dressed, her hair goes up onto these chains, and she looks to the audience to come cut the hair. Next slide. If we're looking for a Sydney artist doing a work on rape, I think Joan Grounds' work, which doesn't come across as dramatically in the documentation as Jill Orr's does, but it's this work called Stinky, which she did about the terror of a mass rapist stalking women in the city. And she devised the performance, or the soundtrack of the performance, from the women's accounts of being raped, how he broke into their house, what he did to them. And it's very disjointed kind of and disturbing soundtrack. And the room is filled with this terrible smell of like creosote, which is what they used to stain fence posts with in the rural areas, because what the women remembered of him, they couldn't describe his face or his body, they could only describe his smell, and it was this smell of creosote. So it's quite a very chilling work, and Grounds just sits in the chair spotlit as any woman, if you like. Now, I thought I'd end on my own work, because people say, "Oh, you used to do performance artists. You never talk about it." So I thought I'd put it in, and I'm putting in this work because it came to my attention when I was on the train in 2013 and going to work, and suddenly there was large billboards at the train station with these images on. They are images that I had given to Alex Martinez-Rowe. And I put it in because it's a performance work that I did, as you can see, at the Women's Art Movement in 1979. It involved small group discussions, so an audience like this came to an exhibition space and were asked to form into small groups of 3 to 5. They were then given a sheet with different questions on and asked to discuss these questions and then come back into a plenary. It was a duplication of the consciousness-raising groups that women used to run in the 1970s to raise their consciousness. A very essentialist, if we look at the history now, thing to do about sharing, women sharing their own experiences, but because it was the art world, of course, it was a mixed audience, and it was one of the first times that male artists, or males, they weren't all artists that came to the performance, were able to experience this consciousness-raising exercise, because in the women's movement they were excluded, because the women's movement was essentialist but also separatist. Men weren't allowed. So if we could show the next slide, which will be my final slide, these were the billboards that I saw as I was going to work. And what had happened was Alex Martinez-Rowe was doing a similar work. She wanted to do a kind of work about consciousness raising. And she asked me if there was anybody I knew who had done these kind of small group processes. And I said, well, there was me and my girlfriend, but I was estranged from my girlfriend and I didn't know how to get in contact with her. But I could send her some of my slides, which was a kind of egotistical kind of way out of it, I guess. And I didn't hear anything out of it more from her. Well, I did. She said, would you mind if I used one of these images in the catalogue and didn't acknowledge you? I said, yeah, that would be fine. That would be fine. Fine, just go ahead and do that. And as I'm going out from the train, boom, 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 these images. And at Spencer Street, they had 5 images on a huge, as big as that billboard. Juliana Engberg was the curator, and she'd recreated this big slideshow. Anyway, I'll just end by talking or concluding with this idea of doing feminism, which has become a new rallying cry within feminist cultural theory or critical theory, as writers like Rosie Braidotti and Claire Hemmings advocate a process driven by politics and by a politic of a new activism. And I think that we are seeing a new activism. I think there's very clearly a new activism in this Biennale, and I've only just been to Carriage Works, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. But I think it's more of the show. But I think we are really in a new activist period. And I think it's refreshing after decades and decades of theories of representation which really dominated the postmodern period and got us into a kind of stasis. I used to say to my students, well, don't bother to get up because you're always already written over a language that you're not in control of. So I think it's very refreshing that activism's coming back, and thank you for inviting me.